Okay, finally I think I have a handle on this thing. I've been grappling with it for a few years now. The problem we have in our society is that there are those who believe in God and those who don't. Or to put it another way, there are those who don't mind admitting to a belief in God, openly admit, and those who don't. Because we don't know what people believe. That's something private between they themselves and them and their I. For instance, my mother. She knew enough about reincarnation to stay away from any open admission to it, because that means she would be taking responsibility for her past, something she didn't experience herself, but she was born with, a pre-birth past, and that must be where I inherited my negligence and my reticence to, instead of recognition of karma and reincarnation. Instead, I denied it. As a 5-year-old, I had access to soul memory. I cognized it. I saw it. But I had no business proving anything to anybody. I didn't need to. At that point, I hadn't been stressed yet. I hadn't been hurt. Now I work like the Dickens to try to prove to everybody, hey, I know something, and nobody wants to listen. Or they shut me out. They know enough to listen to shut me out of a forum. Anyway. So she knew enough about reincarnation to deny its existence because I brought it up to her. I knew specifically one person. I said, hey, that? When I just turned around when I was walking away from you, and I looked back, and when I saw you, it made me think you reminded me of somebody from an historical figure, somebody whose music you respect. See, I'm already giving away too much. Although you may not respect what the person went through, because it was your private hell as well as his. In other words, it's your inheritance. Just like we inherit something, in the material world, we can also inherit a past from the material world that we cannot account for ourselves, yet we inherit it anyway. It might be a gift, it might be a talent, it might be a vice, a bad habit, whatever it is, unfinished business, a person you never seem to get to like, or you never seem to want to like, regardless of whether or not you ever got to, or other people you just get along immediately as if you knew each other for ages, which you probably did. So, anywho, get back to the topic. So, when Maharishi Mahesh Yogi talks about the finest relative and how at the junction between the absolute and the relative, you literally have descriptions of how the absolute manifests, but there's also, in that junction, there's the possibility of the inverse, namely a part of the relative transcending and going to the absolute. Now, when we go to the absolute, when we transcend during meditation, all we lose is the affinity for stress to be attached to us. That's a very significant direction of statement, because, as Charlie Lutz pointed out, we can never give up anything. No sooner than we do, and it hounds us all over again. Like the prisoner who enters prison, and he becomes such a model citizen until he leaves prison and he's back to his fussing around again like he was before, because it waited for him. It waited for him outside of prison, waited for him to get out of prison. While he's in prison, he's always a model citizen, as an example. Anywho, where was I before I got distracted? So as you get out, you turn into like a different person. Where was I going with Charlie, though? Gee, I can't remember why I brought Charlie up, because it was a quote I was going to quote. Anyway, so at the finest relative, there are mechanics to, where does stress go? Right. So when we meditate, we raise our vibration, and this is Charlie's contribution, and that is why bad habits, stress, karma, bad karma, don't come to us anymore, because it can't find us, because it's only attracted to a vibratory rate that's similar to itself. Now, if we never grow up, we continue to vibrate at a certain level of consciousness, and so our karma keeps coming back to us. That's, Bill Murray and Groundhog Day. The things keep happening over and over again. So, yeah, Bill Murray spent a lot of time learning about things that had nothing to do with him growing up. That's lateral motion. That's horizontal growth. Until finally he realized he has to look at the reality from other people's point of view and not just be self-centered all the time in his outlook. And that's when he started to make progress and finally evolved out of the endless cycle, the pernicious Sisyphus cycle of endless death. You go to sleep at night, you wake up the next morning, and the day it's still the same day. So the stress has nowhere else to go but to go somewhere else. And so it's out there in the universe. And if nobody lays claim to it, it's still out there. Now, what is stress? Wait a minute, before I say that. Mother Nature goes to sleep once every 2.2 quadrillion years, according to the appendix of Maharishi's commentary and translation of the first 6 chapters of the Bhagavad Gita. If you do the math, a day of nature, a day of Brahma, a day of the Creator lasts 2.2 quadrillion years. And then the night of Brahma, Pralaya, as Charlie Lutz called it, lasts for an equal length of time, 2.2 quadrillion years. And during that time of sleep, of nature, the stress vanishes. Where does it go? It was energy. It was just energy of a non-coherent typology. Okay? It was destructive. It had no business being in anybody's system, yet it was still, shoved around within the overall system, universe, with nowhere else to go, and it tried to attach itself to people or things. Metallic objects can become stressed. If you keep bending them too much, they break. Well, so they experience stress. So when somebody asked Maharishi, where does stress go when we unstress during meditation? Well, it goes out to the universe. Don't worry about it. Mother Nature takes care of it. Well, Charlie Lutz got Maharishi when he took in the huge numbers. He had to tone down what he had to talk about, because in the early years, he was much more explicit and detailed. Well, Charlie didn't have to worry about that, because he was speaking to a very small group of people, the ones who wanted to listen to him. And Maharishi would say, go hear Charlie, because he'd fill you in, whereas Maharishi was a world teacher, and so he had to keep things very broad, vague, and generalistic in his approach, because he had a big scope to deal with. So the stress, where does it go? It disappears. Now, fundamentally, the universe is only made up of 3 things: Sat, Chit, Ananda, energy, intelligence, and bliss. And if we say that stress is energy, but it lacks intelligence, it's still energy. And we know from E equals mc squared that energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Okay, so where does that energy go? If it lacks the intelligence to belong to anything. We can say, dust to dust, when we die, we go back to the earth. But what about stress, Stress doesn't get buried. It's just floating around in the universe somewhere looking for a hapless victim to attach itself to. But eventually, when Mother Nature goes to sleep, it goes to sleep because there's so much stress, and it can't stay awake anymore. So it goes to sleep, and the stress disappears. So where does it go? I ask you. Well, I already answered the question to myself. It goes back to the absolute. For energy to stay in the system, it has to have a purpose. This is one of the 16 principles of the science of creative intelligence, is purposefulness. Energy in the form of stress, namely energy which has no intelligence to it, has no redeeming value, and if it can't become part of a structure, if a life form cannot find a use for it, I'm sure that demons, demonic forces, fallen angels can find a use for stress, but ultimately they're not ideal. And our mortality labels us as something less than ideal, because the ideal state of life, there shouldn't be any end to growth. So why should we die and put a stop to growth, right? So it shows that the stress of the aging process gets to us and eventually we die. So all this stress doesn't serve a useful purpose because we cannot incorporate it and make lemonade out of lemons, so to speak. Do something useful with it. Create intelligence out of it, because it's inherently non-intelligent, but it's still energy. And because it lacks intelligence, but it's all energy without intelligence, we say it's delusional to call it pleasure. Or you could call it pleasure, but it would take a very narrow point of view, tunnel vision. But in the last analysis, since we are subject to karma, namely the responsibility for our actions, we'd see the flip side, and the flip side, if it's worse than the pleasure we got out of it, then we'll decide, okay, we're not going to go there anymore. But it's still there, out there, even though we don't participate in it. We choose not to get involved with something that's outside of our awareness, or no, excuse me, not so bad as that. It could be outside of our awareness, but even if it's within our window of awareness, if it's outside of our window of self-respect, then we know we're harming ourselves. We're doing something stressful, and it's time to stop. But the stress has to go somewhere. So it lacks bliss, which is, I think, a state of balance between energy and intelligence, in which you don't have too much energy, you don't have too much intelligence, and they're coordinated between them. They're integrated. You know, when we say a fully integrated mind is a fully enlightened mind, it's a saint. Well, that means energy and intelligence are fully integrated, and that's bliss. But when they lack integration, then we don't get bliss, we get pleasure and pain. It's opposite. And we go through a yo-yo experience of having a good time and then not having a good time. So where does the stress go? It goes back to the absolute. If it has no redeeming value, if it cannot be made... See, life forms, creatures, absorb energy. And they do so because they incorporate intelligence into their nature to such a degree that instead of losing energy, they actually gain energy. This is the nature of life, is orderliness. And we keep telling ourselves and each other that this is not the nature of life. The nature of life is entropy, that everything dissipates, breaks down, and goes to pooey, and has to be replaced. Oh, see? It's because we live in a disposable culture that we have that attitude. And we only look at one side of the picture, and not the whole picture. We go to sleep and we wake up refreshed. That's not entropy. So we're not even thinking. Sure, it's entropy at the end of the day. We're filled with worries and fears and angers, and all the arguments happen over dinner time. They never, well, hopefully they don't happen at breakfast time, but, you know, hopefully we awakened from sleep with enough mercy and compassion from the act of sleeping that we don't carry the burdens of the prior evening over to the following day. And that's what Mother Nature does. She gets rid of the stress, just as like we do. She gets rid of the stress. Where does it go? It goes to the absolute, because it has no business staying in the relative anymore, because if it did, the universe would come to a dead stop. And it's no small wonder that science says, oh, this is what happens. It comes to a dead stop and then it has to explode. Well, that's because they deny the existence of God, and they deny the existence of the other half of their existence, which is sleep. Thematically speaking, the other half of our existence is sleep. And yet we know it to be true, yet we deny it from science. Yet we say, oh, give the piece of metal a rest. Stop bending it. Stop playing with it. And it actually heals. You can look this up in scientific literature. If you bend a piece of metal over and over again, it breaks. But if you stop short of it breaking, the weakening effect that you had of bending it back and forth actually has a chance to strengthen itself to a certain degree. And this is why we eventually die, because we don't totally catch up with all our stress. But there are stories in the Vedic literature of people who have reached enlightenment before they reach the age of 35 years, and they get to live as long as they like. And usually the only way they can die is to sacrifice themselves, have somebody kill them so that they can take on the burden of others' people and die with it and relieve us of some of our burden. That's about the only good they can do at that point. They can't do any good while alive, so the only thing left to do is to die with the kind of grace in our direction that they alleviate some of our burden. Anyway, so stress disappears when we go to sleep. It goes back to the, when nature goes to sleep, it goes back to the absolute, and this clears the field of the energy which was just congested, because stress is congestion. It's energy which has no business being in the system because it cannot be incorporated. The life force of a creature cannot incorporate it into its structure, like a crystal. You can't incorporate it, and so it's just congestion. It's a traffic jam of energy. It gets in the way of life's processes, which is to experience bliss. That's why we're so blissful when we wake up in the morning, because we've been cleared of the congestion of stress. Stress is congesting. It congests the nervous system, not just the phlegm in the lungs like I have at the end of a meal. So I have to take all this cayenne pepper capsules to clear my lungs. So stress has to be gotten rid of. And then, so nature goes through its cycles. Now, when humanity chooses to not believe in God, when we engage in the sciences, then we have a problem. How do we account for the way things are? Then what we do is we make an excuse and we say, well, we become believers only in the cycles of nature, that the system, the energy of the system is a closed system, and so the energy is fixed. So we say conservation of energy, which means it just goes around and around and around, converts into different forms, but it has nowhere else to go because it's still locked into the system, namely the system of the universe, the system of a circuit, whatever it might happen to be. The total energy of a system is always constant, and so we say the conservation of energy. That's nice. Except that when Mother Nature goes to sleep, she loses her stress. It goes away. It goes back to the absolute where it came from, when it came out in the form of highly organized, structured energy. Sorry, my teeth are cleaning themselves. So when we came into birth, we were full of integrity. And the same thing with Mother Nature, and when she wakes up, and the same thing when we wake up in the morning. We're full of integrity because our energy is highly structured, and we don't have the congestion of energy which has no business being there because it's not part of any structure, intelligence. It's dumb. It's dumb energy. It's energy of extremely low IQ. So we won't go there. Let's just say it's very lacking in intelligence. So, where was I going with this? So when we don't believe in God, all we believe in are the cycles of nature. We're materialists. Well, I see the cycles, and I can account for them, and so that's all I will admit to. Because anything else, you have to go on the basis of belief. You have to infer it. Well, in order these things to make sense, I'd have to believe in something I cannot see, in a purpose that I cannot know by way of my five senses. I just know it in my heart, if I know it at all. And that is that there is only one vector. It's rooted in the absolute, and that vector is time, or that vector is three different forces which, within the point of view of a closed system, they come in pairs of vectors. They have poles, a north pole and a south pole. And so there's time as one vector. Electromotive force is another pair of vectors. Time is one pair of vectors of two monopoles, a north and a south pole. The electromotive force is another pair of vectors of a north and south monopolar nature. And the magnetomotive force is another pair of vectorial forces. that are monopolar with a north pole and a south pole to each of those vectors. That's 6 vectors of 3 types that make up electricity. And when you talk about electricity, you're talking about matter, you're talking about everything. Because without getting into logistical details, technicalities, which the physicists love to do, we try to keep it simple, right? The common person. We just want to know the overview so we can just deal with things and not really get too involved. And so that's basically it. It's 3 vectorial forces that come in pairs, 3 pairs. But they're all rooted in the absolute. Now, where does this ether come from? This so-called absolute frame of reference that was sought after, never found, and debunked. Well, it's God. Or we say, it's the finest relative at the junction between the absolute and the relative. And at that junction is what we call the ether, but it really is God. Or shall we say, the material essence of God, without having to claim that it is God. So you don't have to believe in God to believe in the ether. But when we take the relative at its finest value, it's practically godlike. It practically is equivalent to God, yet it's still within the relative. And at that level, the engineering wizard known as Eric Paul Dollard, or as he prefers to be called, Eric P. Dollard, D-O-L-L-A-R-D, Dollard with a D on the end, Eric P. Dollard, he affectionately goes over the mathematics of electrical engineering at the finest relative, at the junction point between the absolute and the relative, in which energy can synthesize and energy can decompose. In other words, the forces of energy can come together or break down. And when they come together, we get apple pie, and when they break down, we get what we need upon eating that apple pie. We get what we need to sustain our life. But we had to break it down. So, to create new structures, restructure it as a part of our body. We subsume it. Because that's what life force does within the context of living creatures. We subsume orderliness. We look around, and energy, but also intelligence. We look all around looking for it, and we subsume it. We consume it, and then subsume it, and excrete whatever we can't use. But at the finest relative of electrical engineering, Eric Dollard talks about how the ether synthesizes electrical energy and decomposes it. Synthesizes it from its 3 pairs of forces. He doesn't say pairs, that's me. I'm injecting the word pair. But the 3 forces he does describe. He doesn't use the same words as I do. He does. We agree on the same use of the word time, but I find it's more it's problematic to come up with your own words. It's better to use words that are already there. Well, no. The reason why I use force, there's a reason why I use the electromotive force instead of the dielectric, which is equivalent to the term electrostatic, although it's a better term than electrostatic. And the reason why I use magnetomotive instead of Eric Dollard's choice of the word magnetism is because, not exactly magnetism, it's something much more fundamental, and I want to harp on this theme of force is atomic. It's non-divisible. You can't get any simpler unless you want to go to God. But so long as you want to stay in the relative, that's as simple as you can get. That's atomic. Without having to make up the nightmare of what the physicists cook up, they dream up. Keeping it simple, right? Keep it simple, KISS. Hey, if we say that's a good idea, how come the physicists don't do it? How come they impose something complicated on the electrodynamicist, the electrical engineer? So bogus. Anyway, I don't want to spend too much time ratting on anyone. It's a waste of negativity. Better uses for negativity. So at the finest relative, Eric Dollard can describe it in mathematical terms. I don't bother. I let the artificial intelligence of an electronic simulator do that for me. because all of that mathematical electrical engineering stuff is right in there. And yet we don't pay attention. We say, well, that's an anomaly of the simulator. Hey, $2,000 plus and change simulators don't make boo-boos. They don't. Or else you ask for your money back, and then they either jack up the price or they jack it down because it's not worth the price they're charging, actually, or they fix it. But $2,000 plus for a simulator, which is the one I like to use, Microcap. It's a variety of Berkeley Spice, which is for free, but Microcap charges to make their rendition of it. And for them to charge that amount of money would be fraudulent for them to continue to do so if what people say is true, that I'm a scammer or that I'm nonsensical in what I come up with. It's harder. Let me tell you, it's harder to come up with over unity in Microcap than it is in LT Spice, and it's harder in LT Spice than it is in Paul Falstad's electronic simulator. Paul's is the easiest, and so I got my learning, my nursery experience there, and I spent a lot of time there. But I got bored eventually, and I moved on to more challenging vistas. Yet I still managed to come up with something, and it's called the shorted motor. When you short out a motor, something fascinating happens. It's under light load. Now what I do in my device is I add a load. I add a light load, so it's already built in, and so it wants to go to a surge. It wants to surge and escalate to infinite output because it's already lightly loaded and shorted. So this is in addition to whatever load you impose on it. So now you don't have to collapse it by taking away the light load, by changing the load. This was the problem that John Keeley had. His systems, his devices back in the 1800s were acoustical, and they were highly narrow in their resonance with over unity, so that if the load changed, the output he lost resonance, and the thing lost its over unity. It's very easy to lose over unity when you take a system out of resonance with itself. Resonance just means that your objective to achieve something that is normally quite difficult to achieve by brute force alone is made up for by achieving it by exercising a great deal of intelligence. And when in a Philharmonic orchestra or any kind of ensemble, there's a lot of harmony going on. To be able to work together to create a beautiful outpouring of music or art, a drama performance. There's people got to work together. Meanwhile, the studios are saying, "Okay, we'll give you the money to make this picture, but you'd better work together and work out your problems, right? And figure it out, and somebody better be in charge of each job to make sure everything gets done on time, under budget, under calendar, and under due date, and and then make a good smash at the box office." Well, it's no different. A circuit has to work together, and so instead of just a flashlight circuit, which is extremely simple, an over unity circuit is very sophisticated, even though it doesn't have to be complicated. I didn't pay for my use of Microcap. I used their trial edition, their evaluation edition, which is free, but it hampers me because it forces me to keep my circuit experiments very extremely simple. And it warns me, oops, sorry, you can't put any more components in, that's too many. And so if I have extra coils to short out each other because I get a gain of amplification, but I want to test out some other area of the circuit that doesn't involve shorted coils and how many shorted coils you have in parallel with each other, then I got to take away a few in order to make room to put in a new component somewhere else in the circuit. And since thank God they allow me a certain amount of wiggle room, even though it is restricted, and because I'm dealing with a circuit that's so simple, all I have to do is have two pairs of shorted coils. Two starter coils, which you normally have in an induction motor, and I have to take the main motor coil and create a bifilar coil out of it And then I have my 4 coils, my 2 pairs of coils, to create the shorted transformer, so that each side of the transformer is shorted with itself, and then I short out both sides with each other. So it's a multi-shorted transformer, which becomes motorized. Or at least that's my hope. I haven't been able to simulate motorization of the thing, but I like to imagine that, yeah, I think so, because I've studied, what little I've studied about DC motors is that they're not much conceptually different than what I'm doing. So but I'm not doing DC, I'm doing AC. So I don't really know if it would work, but I like to think that it would. I've come pretty close, given my limitations, my poverty of money, not poverty of intelligence, certainly not poverty of time, and motivation for that matter. So I have a wealth of motivation and time, and I'm making best use of my limited resources, because I can come up with these things. It's inherent within my soul to pull it out of me, and that's what the simulator did. Spending night after night, hours upon hours, I'm telling you, I racked myself silly, and I still do when I'm writing about it. But when I was training myself on the simulator, I racked myself silly, because I was pushing myself to learn in the shortest period of time what turned out to be not learning after all. I was simply remembering it. I was remembering what I already knew. Now, it bothers me that we don't have a better world. It bothers me that I don't have a better life. So I'm motivated. I do something about it. Something constructive. So that I don't dwell on my problems or insufficiencies. At least I have my health. I have to work. I've had to work at that. I've taken a whole lifetime to work at the skill of developing a good health. And I'm still working at it. There's still room for improvement. And I keep learning things too. Amazing. So, if we don't want to believe in God, then we're not going to believe in the ether, because the ether is simply the finest relative at the junction between the absolute and the relative. The absolute being the essential nature of God without having to be God himself or itself. But the essential nature of God, that's still pretty rarefied, because it's transcendental. It's outside the field of creation. It's absolute. Yet, how does the absolute interact with the relative? Well, there's a junction point between them. It's called Dharma. D-H-A-R-M-A in the Sanskrit. Well, in the English transliteration of Sanskrit. Dharma. I'm accentuating that DH sound. Anyway, that's the name of the junction point, the gap between the absolute and the relative. And there's an interchange. It's bidirectional. The absolute is constantly tugging on the relative, saying, come on, it's better over here. So it's not, the grass is greener on the other side. No, it's the grass is greener on my side, and we want you to come here. Come here. Why don't you? It's very nice here. It's blissful. Oh, it's my God. It's beautiful. It's the transcendental absolute. Couldn't get it be any better. Meanwhile, the relative is tugging on the absolute, saying, come on, we need some more of your manifestation out here to make the world out here a better place. Because it's not that we're complaining the world is screwed up, it's that it's missing something. Send us an avatar, send us an invention, send us a new food group, send us a new spice, something to make life more interesting. And so this constantly bidirectional tug. It's not a war, it's not a tug of war. It's just two tugs going in opposite directions with two opposing purposes that are literally ignoring each other. And maybe this is what Eric Dollard meant by each is the denial of the other. It could be, because each is. So you get the materialists who deny God, and they say, but, well, no, actually, the problem with materialists is they're not asking for a handout. No, they're totally, oh God, I got a cramp in my, oh shit, I gotta stop. Sorry, signing off.